What is your shot? I've got to get the hell out of here right now. Story. When I was 17 I met with a 23-year-old guy for a mall date. Can't remember his name for the life of me. I had just gotten out of a horrible relationship and was trying to distract myself. We had dinner, and when the waiter brought the check, the guy told me he had forgotten his wallet in his car and that if I went with him, he could grab it. I told him it was fine and paid for the meal myself. We went into a couple shops, but he kept asking me questions about my ex-boyfriend. Also he mentioned that he had been in jail, but wouldn't tell me what for, and I was nervous. Then things came to a head when he kept saying, "Hey, just come to my car for a second please. Let's listen to music," and kept getting increasingly anxious every time I declined. I was so scared. I immediately pretended to have a period emergency so I could get out of there, and luckily I had parked in a different lot than he did. I still have no idea what his intentions were, but man, that was terrifying. I was walking to my house from my ex house very early in the morning when I saw this little girl with a backpack running for her life from two big street dogs. At that moment I didn't think, and I ran towards the dogs and missed a kick. The two dogs came after me, biting my legs and arm. They were out of control, and these were like the longest 5 minutes of my life. I couldn't stop them from biting me. The little girl kept running until I didn't see her anymore. It was just me and the dogs attacking me. I tried to climb a fence to get inside a house, but I couldn't. When a taxi driver stopped and went out of the car with a short stick, and he tried to scare them off, giving me a chance to run. And without thinking I got inside the car. The guy just ran a couple of times around the car with the dogs behind until he got in, and he drove off like really fast. He took me to the hospital where I got a lot of stitches on my legs, arms and hands. That guy is my hero. Every now and then I go to his taxi stop and give them sandwiches or something. We never knew what happened to those dogs. One time I was driving through Kansas in the middle of the night with my girlfriend on a road trip, summer of 2017. We had issues with the car breaking down in Nebraska and were sputting along until we reached Colby, Kansas, and waited for night, so the roads were less busy. As we were driving along, not HWY 70, but just south to stay off the highways, a semi caught up to us. The car didn't want to go past 50 to 60 miles per hour, and I didn't want to push it and break down. Needless to say, I was going too slow for this semi truck. For about an entire hour this guy's riding my A, flashing his lights, etc. Never honked his horns though. I would slow down and pull off to the side a little bit to let him pass, but every time I did he would slow down too and give me a ton of space. It's now about 2 to 3 AM. We are in the middle of nowhere, coming up close to the border of Colorado. He is still constantly riding up to my A and turning his lights on and off again. We finally come across a gas station and pull over to a pump on the right side. I cannot emphasize how literal I mean by middle of nowhere. It's flat deserts forever in all directions. It's an empty shell gas station that is closed, and we hope the truck will just pass us, and we pretend to pump gas. This effing truck slows down all the way and stops right there on the road next to us. He proceeds to back his truck up enough to pull into the gas station behind us, perpendicular to our car. I start loosing my and looking around. I'm standing outside of my car and my girlfriend is screaming for me to get back in the car. This guy gets out of the semi and starts walking directly towards us. He is only about 50 yards away when I notice a small brown pickup truck sitting on the backside of the shell, eerily placed. I notice there is someone in it. I run towards him. As I get closer I realize there is a police badge painted on the side of this brown pickup, and the man inside is actually an officer. I can only imagine what this guy on late night duty was thinking when I'm running up to him. He rolls down the window with a confused look on his face. My girlfriend is screaming at me in panic as this guy gets within 10 yards of the car, while I'm spitting about 50 words out of my mouth in about 2 seconds explaining our situation. The officer doesn't say a word and just drives around our car. The man notices and does an immediate U-turn back towards his truck. As the officer is yelling at him to stop, I hop back into my car, look in the rearview mirror for a second to see the officer getting out to try to talk to this guy. I turn on the car, hit the gas, and drive into Colorado. A few minutes later, I will spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if that officer wasn't just sitting there that night. Whoever you are, man, Bless your soul. My parents liked going to the backyard gatherings of their friends, which were thinly veiled excuses to get drunk. They dragged us kids all along for some reason, but I never much cared for sitting around watching a bunch of adults get hammered. There was always something stupid that happened, and more often than not it was violent. Now, you all have to understand that these friends that they associated with were scum, wannabe gangsters, drunks and addicts, petty thieves, domestic abusers, and one ex-convict who claimed that he had helped kill pedophiles in prison. Just all around the very picture of the dregs of our modern society. The night in question had the full cast of lowlives freshly scraped from the bottom of the barrel and put into one backyard, and, in hindsight, there's no way something wouldn't happen. It all started when one guy put his hands on his wife. The ex-con guy didn't take kindly to that and punched him out. This guy's buddies got up to square off and so did the ex-con's buddies. It quickly devolved into yelling and exchanged blows until one of the guys, who lived next door, came out with a refined chainsaw. So, I'm inside the house on the property and hear people yelling, screaming, and a pregnant woman who was crying ran in with some kids. I sat there bewildered until my parents ran in, both seeming almost sober from the adrenaline, and essentially told my brothers and I, we need to go now. So we stayed at a cousin's house close by because they were still in really no condition to drive, and to this day I refuse to go to any of those style little gatherings. Senior year of high school and a friend of mine and I decide to explore a pioneer cemetery near the railroad tracks after dark on Halloween night. We were totally sober and just looking for a good way to scare ourselves. To get there, you have to park off an lit road that is at the end of an abandoned industrial area and walk about 1/4 mile on an unmaintained dirt road. Bushes overgrown, weeds up to your waist, etc. Before you get to the cemetery, we brought no flashlights, just used the light of the moon to make our way. We were almost there and had been whispering and giggling the whole way when all of a sudden we both got quiet at the same time. I felt this overwhelming sense of doom hit my whole body all at once, and I stopped in my tracks. She did the same. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt like someone had poured a bucket of ice water down my back. My heart was racing. My friend and I were just looking around and listening, and her eyes were so wide when I looked at her that I could make them out perfectly in the darkness. We stayed like that for about a minute, just listening and hearing nothing. I said to her loudly, "We should probably get back to your brother in the truck point. I'm sure he is mad we are taking so long," thinking a good bluff would make me feel better. Just over my shoulder from behind a tall bush, but I swear it sounded like it was right in my ear, a man's voice said quietly, "Yeah, you probably should point." We both just turned and ran as fast as we could back to her truck. It felt like an eternity to get there, and we both threw open the doors and jumped inside. She jammed the key in the ignition and started the engine, but being a new driver and terrified, she kept letting the clutch out too soon and the engine would die. Finally, after about 5 attempts, she got the engine going and we tore out of there and back to my house. During that whole run I was terrified to look behind me. I didn't look out the window as we were trying to drive away either. We, being young and foolish, laughed about it later and almost convinced ourselves that it didn't happen. A few years later, I was talking to a sheriff from that county and told him the story. He looked at me like I was a total idiot and said that there was a huge homeless encampment there for years due to the proximity of the railroad tracks and the relative isolation in an urban area, small grocery store and other resources within walking distance, etc. They used to patrol that area frequently because of that encampment. I think my friend and I were lucky we didn't get ourselves into more trouble than we did that night. Man, we were naive. I'd recently moved to another country and met an American guy with whom I'd decided to go drinking in a small village about a half hour away from the city where we both lived. We had a few beers, some laughs, a little karaoke, and decided to call it a night. My seal had broken much earlier in the night, and in the taxi on the way home, nature called once more. I tried to hold it as long as I could, but it was a beer bus after all. At this point, I only knew a few words in the local language, so I asked my pal, who was fluent, to translate to the driver that I'd appreciate it if he'd pull over so I could relieve myself. I've learned since then that the locals have a habit of A. Pretending they don't understand foreigners if it inconveniences them. B. Make no effort to listen when a foreigner speaks because they assume they won't understand. Or C. Genuinely don't understand due to pronunciation and or quirks related to different local dialects. I've no idea which of the aforementioned language barriers occurred on this particular night, but the driver continued to ignore the American, even after he had repeated himself numerous times. I had finally resigned myself to the fact that I was either going to have to hold it in or piss myself on the backseat of this dude's cab when, suddenly, the American, fed up with what he, wrongly or rightly, perceived as being ignored, grabs the wheel of the car and spins us off of the road. We go hurtling into a field. The driver slams on the brakes, and we narrowly avoid smashing headfirst into a tree. For the next 30 seconds or so, I have no idea what happened, because I immediately jumped out of the car to ease my bladder. After the jubilation over my release had worn off, it finally occurred to me what the F had just happened. I looked up and saw the American guy scuffling with the taxi driver that he had just scared half to death. He broke free, and we started across the field. About 500 meters away from the car, he realized that he'd left his bag, including his passport, in the car. He went back, and I left. I hitchhiked for around 10 minutes along the road until somebody picked me up. I later discovered that the guy was an ex-Marine with the words "I will kill you" tattooed across his chest. The armed forces had seriously screwed him up, and he had huge anger issues. I always found him pleasant enough, but after that experience, I kept a little distance. As to what happened after he returned to the car, I never got the full story. I expect he had to pay reparations to the driver and a bribe to the police.